When I first arrived in Yakutsk, I believed I understood cold weather. I had lived through storms, frozen roads, and winters that covered entire cities in snow for months. But nothing prepared me for the first breath I took outside the airport terminal. The air entered my lungs like shattered glass. My eyelashes froze within seconds. Every exposed piece of skin began to sting as if invisible needles were piercing it repeatedly. The taxi driver laughed when he saw my expression. He said newcomers always looked terrified during their first winter in the coldest city in the world. Outside the windows, the city looked like a frozen dream. Thick smoke rose from every building because engines were never turned off. Cars stayed running day and night to prevent the motors from freezing solid. The streets were covered in packed snow instead of asphalt because the temperature remained below -40 degrees for weeks. I watched people walking calmly through the icy darkness as if this life was normal. Mothers pulled children on sleds. Workers smoked cigarettes while their beards turned white with frost. Teenagers stood outside convenience stores wearing fur hats and heavy boots. Nobody seemed surprised by the brutal weather except me. My apartment building stood on concrete pillars above the permafrost. The landlord explained that the ground beneath the city never completely thawed. If buildings transferred too much heat into the soil, the frozen earth could soften and destroy the foundations. Inside the apartment, the heating pipes were so hot that I had to open windows even during the night. The contrast between indoor heat and outdoor cold felt unnatural. Every morning became a battle against layers of clothing. Thermal underwear. Wool socks. Fur-lined pants. Thick sweaters. Heavy gloves. A scarf wrapped across my face. Nothing could fully protect the body from the cold. After 10 minutes outside, my thighs burned painfully and my fingers slowly lost feeling. One evening, my phone battery died within minutes because the temperature drained its power instantly. Another day, I accidentally touched a metal railing with bare skin and felt it cling to my hand for a horrifying second before I pulled away. The people of Yakutsk had learned to respect the cold the way sailors respect the sea. Carelessness could kill you. Yet life continued with surprising normality. Restaurants stayed open. Couples went on dates. University students hurried to classes. Markets sold frozen fish stacked like pieces of wood because refrigeration was unnecessary. Old women sold meat outdoors in open-air stalls without fear of spoilage. Even death behaved differently there. The frozen ground made burials nearly impossible during winter, so graves were often prepared with fires that burned for days to soften the earth enough for digging. I met a local teacher named Lena during my second week in the city. She invited me to drink hot tea after noticing how badly I struggled with the weather. She told me that Yakutsk teaches patience. The cold forces people to slow down and think carefully about every decision. A forgotten glove or an empty fuel tank could become a disaster. She had lived there her entire life and spoke about the winter with strange affection. According to her, the cold created strong communities because survival depended on cooperation. Neighbors checked on each other constantly. Strangers helped push frozen cars through the snow. People shared supplies during storms. In warmer cities, she said, people often ignored each other because comfort made them selfish. I listened while staring through the frosted window at the endless darkness outside. In December, the sun barely appeared above the horizon. Daylight lasted only a few hours before the city returned to blackness illuminated by yellow streetlights and clouds of frozen breath. I began to understand why Yakutsk felt so isolated from the rest of the world. It was not only the geography. It was the climate itself. The cold created an invisible wall between this city and ordinary human life. Yet despite the hardship, there was beauty hidden inside the frozen silence. At night, the snow sparkled beneath the moonlight like fields of crushed diamonds. The air became so clear that distant sounds traveled for incredible distances. Sometimes I could hear dogs barking from several streets away. Sometimes I stood alone outside my apartment building, breathing carefully through my scarf, watching the pale green northern lights move slowly across the sky above the frozen city. By January, I had stopped checking the weather forecast because every day looked the same. -45. -50. Sometimes colder. The numbers no longer shocked me. Instead, I learned to judge danger by smaller details. The way the snow squeaked beneath my boots meant the temperature had dropped further during the night. The thickness of the frost on apartment windows revealed how hard the wind was blowing outside. Even silence carried information in Yakutsk. On the coldest mornings, the city sounded strangely empty because machines struggled to function and people avoided unnecessary movement. I developed a routine that revolved entirely around survival. Every evening, I placed my phone near the heater so the battery would last longer the next day. I kept extra gloves inside my backpack because moisture from melted snow could freeze fabric solid within minutes. Before sleeping, I checked whether my water pipes were still flowing because frozen plumbing was one of the city's most common disasters. One night, the pipes in a nearby apartment burst after the heating failed briefly. Water flooded the staircase and froze almost instantly into thick layers of ice. Residents spent hours breaking frozen chunks apart with metal tools while wearing winter coats indoors. The city constantly fought against freezing. It was not a temporary emergency. It was daily life. Cars fascinated me most. Drivers treated their vehicles like living creatures that needed constant protection. Parking lots resembled giant fields of growling engines surrounded by white smoke. Many people never turned their cars off during winter, even while shopping or sleeping. Fuel was expensive, but a frozen engine could leave someone stranded in deadly temperatures. Mechanics worked in heated garages packed with damaged batteries, cracked tires, and frozen fuel lines. One taxi driver told me he once survived an entire night trapped inside his broken car during a snowstorm by keeping the engine barely alive with the last of his gasoline. He spoke calmly, almost casually, while smoking a cigarette near the station entrance. Stories that sounded terrifying to outsiders were ordinary memories for locals. During one particularly brutal week, schools closed because temperatures fell below -55 degrees. Yet adults still went to work. Buses continued operating. Construction workers hammered metal while wearing thick fur masks. I watched road crews repairing broken pipes in the darkness while steam rose around them like battlefield smoke. Their eyelashes were completely white with frost. Nobody complained openly. Complaining did not change the weather. People simply endured it. I began spending evenings at a small cafe near the market district where workers gathered after long shifts. The windows were always covered with ice patterns that looked like tree branches. Inside, the air smelled of soup, black tea, wet wool, and cigarette smoke trapped inside heavy jackets. There I met Pavel, an electrician who repaired heating systems across the city. He explained that winter failures could become catastrophic within hours. If heating stopped in an apartment building during extreme cold, residents might need evacuation before the pipes froze solid. Entire neighborhoods depended on fragile systems operating continuously beneath impossible conditions. Once, he spent 16 straight hours repairing damaged electrical lines during a blizzard because hundreds of families risked losing heat overnight. When he finished telling the story, he shrugged and drank his tea as if nothing heroic had happened. In Yakutsk, survival itself created quiet heroes everywhere. Despite the hardship, people still searched for happiness. On weekends, families visited outdoor festivals where children played on giant ice slides carved from frozen blocks. Couples took photographs beside illuminated sculptures shaped like castles and animals. Music echoed through frozen parks while vendors sold hot meat pastries from steaming stalls. I attended one winter celebration where dancers performed traditional Yakut culture in elaborate fur clothing beneath colorful lights. The audience stood outside for hours in temperatures that would close entire cities elsewhere in the world. Their faces glowed with excitement instead of misery. I realized then that the people of Yakutsk did not simply survive the cold. They built their identity around overcoming it together. One night, while walking home after midnight, I stopped beside the frozen Lena River. During winter, the massive river transformed into a solid highway of ice connecting distant villages. Trucks crossed its surface carrying fuel, food, and supplies. The moonlight reflected across the frozen emptiness so brightly that it hurt my eyes. The air was so cold my breathing sounded loud inside my hood. I stood there alone, surrounded by endless snow and darkness, listening to the distant hum of engines from the city behind me. For the first time since arriving, I no longer felt like a visitor trapped in an impossible climate. Instead, I felt like the cold itself had begun reshaping me slowly from the inside. February arrived with deeper darkness and colder winds. In Yakutsk, winter did not weaken gradually like it did in other places. It remained brutal and absolute, as if the season itself refused to surrender control. By then, I had learned to keep my eyes lowered during strong winds because exposed tears could freeze painfully against the skin. My beard collected tiny icicles every morning during the walk to work. Even breathing required caution. Too much cold air too quickly could trigger coughing fits that burned deep inside the lungs. Yet strangely, my body had begun adapting. -30 now felt comfortable compared to the temperatures I had experienced earlier. That realization frightened me more than the weather itself. One Saturday morning, Lena invited me to visit the central market. She claimed I still had not truly understood Yakutsk until I saw how people bought food during winter. We walked together through streets covered in thick snow while the pale sunlight barely touched the tops of buildings. Smoke drifted upward from chimneys into a white sky. The cold pressed against my face like solid pressure. When we reached the market, I immediately noticed something surreal. Meat and fish were displayed outdoors without refrigeration. Entire frozen fish stood upright like carved statues. Thick slabs of horse meat hung from metal hooks in the open air. Vendors struck frozen cuts with knives that produced sounds like breaking wood. Nothing rotted because nature itself functioned as a giant freezer. Elderly women wrapped in fur coats sold berries collected during summer and preserved naturally by the cold. Lena explained that horse meat was extremely important in Yakut cuisine because the animal survived harsh winters better than many other livestock. Nearby, a vendor offered frozen raw fish sliced into thin pieces. The locals called it stroganina. People dipped the icy strips into salt and spices before eating them immediately. I hesitated at first, but Lena laughed at my nervous expression and insisted I try it. The fish melted slowly inside my mouth with surprising freshness. Everything about life there depended on adaptation. Food, clothing, transportation, architecture, even social behavior. The market itself felt less like commerce and more like evidence of humanity refusing to surrender to climate. We entered an indoor section filled with warmth, steam, and crowded voices. Workers drank tea beside large pots of soup while children chased each other between tables. Despite the freezing world outside, the atmosphere inside felt alive and intimate. A musician played traditional Yakut melodies on a string instrument near the entrance. The sound carried sadness and endurance at the same time. Lena told me many local songs focused on nature because survival in Yakutia had always depended on respecting the land rather than conquering it. During lunch, she spoke about her childhood winters. Schools rarely closed unless temperatures became truly dangerous. Children learned early how to recognize frostbite. Parents taught them never to touch metal with bare skin and never to travel alone during storms. She described how people in rural villages sometimes disappeared while crossing frozen landscapes between settlements. Even modern technology could not fully protect against the scale of Siberian wilderness. Hearing her stories made me realize how fragile urban life actually was there. The city existed like a warm island surrounded by frozen emptiness capable of killing anyone careless enough to underestimate it. Later that evening, I experienced one of the most frightening moments since arriving. While returning home, my bus suddenly stopped moving in the middle of a poorly lit road. The engine failed with a violent metallic sound. Almost immediately, passengers began reacting with visible concern. Nobody panicked loudly, but everyone understood the seriousness of losing transportation in such temperatures. The driver repeatedly tried restarting the engine while clouds of white breath filled the interior. After several failed attempts, passengers quietly exited into the darkness and began walking toward the nearest district. I followed them through the freezing wind, feeling my face slowly lose sensation beneath my scarf. The cold seemed stronger away from the buildings and lights. Every exposed inch of skin burned intensely. An older man walking beside me noticed I was struggling and adjusted my scarf tighter around my cheeks without saying much. Small acts of kindness like that had become common in Yakutsk. Survival created instinctive solidarity between strangers. By the time I finally reached my apartment building, my legs ached from tension and cold. Inside, I removed layers of frozen clothing while the heating pipes hissed loudly beside the walls. I stood near the window holding a cup of boiling tea and looked outside at the endless snow-covered city. Somewhere below, engines continued growling through the night while frozen smoke floated beneath the streetlights. I realized that fear never completely disappeared in Yakutsk. The cold remained dangerous every single day. But people continued building lives there anyway. They fell in love, raised children, opened businesses, celebrated birthdays, buried their dead. The city existed because human beings were stubborn enough to create warmth in a place where nature offered none freely. March brought a strange illusion of hope to Yakutsk. The temperatures remained brutally cold, yet the sunlight lingered slightly longer each afternoon. People spoke about spring as if discussing a distant relative slowly approaching from another country. Nobody expected warmth soon, but even a few extra minutes of daylight changed the city's mood. Children stayed outside longer after school. Couples walked together beneath the orange glow of sunset. For the first time since arriving, I noticed birds returning to rooftops near my apartment building. Their small movements against the frozen sky felt almost miraculous. Around that time, Pavel invited me to travel with him across the frozen Lena River to help repair electrical equipment in a small settlement outside the city. The journey terrified me immediately. During winter, the river transformed into a massive road of ice thick enough to support heavy trucks. Still, the idea of driving across a frozen river several kilometers wide felt insane to me. Pavel laughed when he saw my reaction. He told me locals trusted the ice more than many normal roads. Early the next morning, we left before sunrise in his old truck. The engine had been running all night outside his apartment building. Inside the vehicle, the heater blasted hot air while the windows remained covered with frost along the edges. As we approached the river crossing, I saw dozens of vehicles already moving across the endless white surface. Trucks carried fuel tanks, construction materials, food supplies, and machinery toward isolated villages cut off from the outside world for much of the year. Without these winter roads, many settlements would struggle to survive. The river itself looked endless. Snowstorms had erased visible boundaries between ice and horizon. Driving across it felt like traveling through another planet. Beneath us lay dark freezing water hidden under meters of ice. Pavel drove calmly while smoking cigarettes and listening to old Russian rock songs on the radio. I sat stiffly beside him, staring through the windshield at tire tracks disappearing into white emptiness. At one point, he pointed towards several abandoned vehicles partially buried in snow far from the main route. Some had broken through weak sections of ice years earlier. Others simply failed mechanically and were left behind because recovery became too dangerous or expensive. Their frozen remains sat there like monuments to human fragility. The settlement we reached consisted of scattered wooden buildings surrounded by snow-covered forest. Smoke rose from chimneys into the pale afternoon sky. Dogs barked loudly as we arrived. The cold there felt even sharper without the protection of the city. Pavel worked inside a small electrical station while I waited nearby with several local residents drinking tea. An elderly man named Mikhail spoke about life in remote Yakutia. He had spent decades hunting and fishing across the region before settling permanently in the village. According to him, modern city people feared silence because they had forgotten how powerful nature truly was. He described winters spent sleeping inside temporary shelters while temperatures dropped below -60 degrees. He spoke about wolves following sled routes through forests and travelers navigating frozen rivers beneath northern lights. His face looked carved from wood after years of surviving harsh weather. Yet his eyes remained calm and deeply observant. Before sunset, he invited us to his home for dinner. Inside, the small wooden house felt unbelievably warm. Thick carpets covered the floors and the smell of cooked meat filled the air. His wife served soup, black bread, frozen berries, and roasted fish while an old television played quietly in the background. Their grandchildren sat near the stove doing homework beneath dim yellow light. Watching the family together made me understand something important about Yakutia. Warmth there was never taken for granted. Every heated room felt precious because people understood exactly what waited outside the walls. Human closeness carried greater meaning in extreme environments. Even ordinary dinners felt like victories against the cold. We left the settlement late that evening and began driving back across the frozen river under complete darkness. The headlights illuminated endless snow while stars burned fiercely above us. Then suddenly, Pavel stopped the truck and turned off the engine. Silence swallowed everything instantly. No wind. No traffic. No distant machinery. Only frozen emptiness stretching in every direction. We stepped outside carefully onto the ice. The cold attacked immediately, but the beauty of the moment overwhelmed my fear. Above us, green and blue northern lights moved slowly across the sky like living curtains of light. Their reflections shimmered faintly on the frozen river beneath our boots. Pavel stood quietly beside me with his hands inside his coat pockets. After several minutes, he spoke softly without looking away from the sky. He said people who survive long enough in Yakutsk eventually stop asking why anyone would choose to live there. Instead, they begin wondering how life anywhere else could ever feel meaningful after experiencing something so harsh and beautiful at the same time. By April, the city of Yakutsk entered its most unpredictable season. Winter still controlled the air, but the earth beneath the snow slowly began resisting the cold. During the day, sunlight reflected violently from icy streets and forced people to squint constantly behind dark glasses. At night, temperatures dropped again with brutal intensity, freezing whatever had softened during daylight hours. Sidewalks became dangerous landscapes of uneven ice and hidden water. Every step required attention. The city no longer felt frozen solid. Instead, it felt unstable, caught between two seasons fighting for control. One morning, I woke to a sound I had never heard before. A deep cracking noise echoed through the neighborhood like distant gunfire. At first, I thought construction equipment had collapsed nearby, but Lena later explained the sound came from shifting ice along the Lena River. As temperatures slowly changed, enormous sections of frozen surface began breaking apart under pressure. The river groaned like a living creature waking after a long sleep. People treated the breakup season with caution because flooding could become catastrophic once the ice finally moved. Entire districts monitored water levels constantly. Emergency vehicles appeared more frequently near the riverbanks. Despite the danger, the changing season transformed people emotionally. After months of darkness and deadly cold, everyone carried visible excitement beneath their exhaustion. Street markets grew busier. Teenagers gathered outdoors without hurrying between buildings. Music drifted from open windows for the first time since my arrival. I noticed more laughter on public buses. Even strangers seemed slightly more patient with each other. Surviving another Yakut winter created a shared feeling of accomplishment across the city. One afternoon, Lena invited me to visit her parents outside the central district. Their apartment building overlooked a large industrial area where heating pipes stretched above ground like giant metal veins crossing the snow. During the walk, she explained that permafrost complicated nearly every aspect of construction in Yakutsk. Water systems, electricity, sewage, and heating all required special engineering because the frozen ground constantly threatened infrastructure. If the permafrost thawed too deeply, buildings could tilt or collapse entirely. Some older structures already leaned noticeably after decades of environmental changes. Climate change frightened many locals because warming temperatures threatened the fragile balance holding the city together. Lena's father, Sergei, worked for years maintaining heating systems across residential neighborhoods. During dinner, he described winters when failures nearly destroyed apartment blocks. Once, a major pipe burst during -50-degree weather and covered an entire street in boiling water before freezing into thick layers of ice. Workers spent days repairing the damage while residents crowded temporarily into schools and government buildings for warmth. Sergei spoke with the calm tone common among Yakutsk residents when discussing disasters. People there accepted risk as part of ordinary existence. Fear wasted energy needed for survival. After dinner, we sat drinking tea while old Soviet songs played softly from a radio in the kitchen. Through the window, I watched smoke rising from factory chimneys against the darkening sky. Children kicked a frozen ball between snowbanks below the apartment building while their parents shouted warnings about thin ice near drainage canals. The city remained trapped between winter and spring. That tension existed everywhere. A few days later, I witnessed the river break up personally. Crowds gathered near safe observation areas along the Lena River as enormous sections of ice began crashing against each other with terrifying force. The sound resembled thunder mixed with explosions. Massive frozen slabs twisted and shattered while dark water surged upward between them. Entire chunks of ice the size of trucks rotated violently in the current before disappearing downstream. People watched silently despite the danger. The scene carried strange emotional power because it marked the end of another extreme winter. Children pointed excitedly while elderly residents stood quietly with folded arms. As if observing an ancient ritual repeated every year of their lives. Nearby emergency crews monitored the river continuously in case flooding threatened nearby districts. Watching the frozen river break apart felt symbolic to me. During my first months in Yakutsk, the city had seemed rigid and unchanging, trapped forever beneath ice and darkness. But now I understood that everything there moved in cycles of survival and release. The people adapted because they knew winter always ended eventually, even after the longest nights and coldest mornings. Later that evening, I walked home alone beneath a sky still glowing faintly after sunset. Snowmelt dripped from rooftops onto frozen sidewalks. The air smelled different now. Colder than most winters elsewhere in the world, yet carrying the first subtle traces of earth and water beneath the ice. For the first time since arriving in Yakutsk, I removed my gloves briefly while standing outside and realized the air no longer hurt immediately against my skin. The season was changing. And somehow, without noticing exactly when it happened, I realized I had changed too. May arrived slowly in Yakutsk, but when the transformation finally began, it happened with shocking speed. Snowbanks that had stood beside roads for months collapsed into gray rivers of slush. Ice hanging from rooftops crashed onto sidewalks without warning. The city that once felt frozen solid suddenly became wet, unstable, and noisy. Water dripped constantly from pipes and balconies. Streets turned into oceans of mud mixed with melting snow, oil, and dirt trapped beneath winter ice for half a year. People walked carefully around enormous puddles while cars sprayed brown water across sidewalks. The beautiful white landscape that had once reflected moonlight like crystal now looked exhausted and wounded. Yet despite the ugliness, everyone seemed happier. The return of sunlight changed human behavior almost immediately. After enduring endless darkness, residents rushed outdoors whenever temperatures rose above freezing. Parks filled with children. Couples sat on benches beside dirty melting snowbanks as if enjoying tropical weather. Music played from open apartment windows late into the evening. Even the city itself sounded different. During winter, engines dominated everything. Now birds returned to rooftops and trees. Dogs barked from courtyards. People talked loudly in the streets without scarves covering their mouths. One afternoon, I visited the central market again and barely recognized it. The frozen fish still existed, but now fresh vegetables and fruits from southern regions began appearing beside traditional winter foods. Vendors smiled more often. Some even stood outside without gloves. The smell of wet earth mixed with smoke and food stalls filled the air. It felt like the entire city had survived a long illness and was finally breathing normally again. But spring in Yakutsk brought new dangers. The melting permafrost created serious problems beneath roads and buildings. Entire sections of pavement cracked apart unexpectedly. Sidewalks collapsed into deep muddy holes. Construction crews worked everywhere repairing damaged pipes and unstable foundations exposed after winter. Pavel spent most days responding to electrical failures caused by melting ground and flooding basements. He once told me spring exhausted workers more than winter because the city itself seemed to break apart all at once. One evening, he invited me to join several friends at a traditional sauna known as a banya. The building stood near the edge of the city beside a small forest still covered with patches of snow. Inside, thick steam filled the wooden rooms while men sat shirtless discussing politics, work, and fishing trips planned for summer. The heat felt overwhelming after months spent protecting myself from cold. Sweat poured down my skin while branches soaked in hot water struck against backs and shoulders to improve circulation. Afterward, several men ran outside barefoot and jumped directly into freezing water beside the building before returning inside laughing loudly. Watching them, I realized how deeply extreme climate shaped local identity. People in Yakutsk measured life through endurance. Pain and comfort existed closely together. That same night, we stayed outside drinking tea near a fire while the sky remained strangely bright despite the late hour. Spring days were becoming longer rapidly. Darkness no longer arrived completely. Instead, the horizon glowed pale blue through most of the night. Pavel explained that summer in Yakutia created the opposite problem from winter. Instead of endless darkness, people experienced almost constant daylight. Sleep became difficult because the body lost track of time. Mosquitoes would soon arrive in enormous clouds from wetlands surrounding the city. Temperatures could rise surprisingly high during summer, creating sharp contrasts with the deadly winters. Yakutsk never allowed moderation. Everything there existed at extremes. A few days later, I experienced my first true spring storm in the city. Heavy rain fell across melting streets while powerful winds tore remaining snow from rooftops. The ground transformed into deep mud within hours. Public buses splashed through flooded roads while pedestrians balanced carefully along narrow dry edges beside buildings. Yet beneath the chaos, life continued with familiar determination. Construction workers repaired damaged roads in freezing rain. Vendors still sold food outdoors beneath plastic covers. Children jumped deliberately into puddles while exhausted parents shouted after them. Nobody expected comfort from nature. They adapted instead. Late one evening, I walked toward the river alone. The Lena no longer looked frozen and silent. Huge sections of broken ice drifted slowly downstream beneath dark water reflecting the pale night sky. The air smelled of wet wood and thawing earth. Across the riverbanks, distant fires burned where people gathered for early spring celebrations. I stood there listening to moving water for a long time. Months earlier, that same river had carried trucks across solid ice beneath temperatures cold enough to freeze exposed skin within minutes. Now it flowed freely again, indifferent to the suffering winter had caused. In Yakutsk, survival meant accepting constant transformation. Nothing remained frozen forever. Neither rivers, nor seasons, nor people. June arrived like an explosion. After months of white silence, Yakutsk suddenly became loud, green, wet, and alive. The speed of transformation felt unreal. Trees that had stood frozen and dead-looking for most of the year burst into bright leaves within days. Grass pushed through muddy ground almost overnight. Markets overflowed with fruit, flowers, and fresh bread carried from warmer regions. Children rode bicycles through streets that had recently been buried beneath snowdrifts taller than cars. The city that once survived under darkness now refused to sleep under endless daylight. The sun barely disappeared beyond the horizon at night. Even after midnight, the sky glowed pale blue and gold. At first, I enjoyed the endless light. People stayed outdoors late into the evening laughing beside riverside cafes and crowded parks. Music echoed through open courtyards. Couples walked hand in hand through warm air carrying the smell of wet earth and smoke from outdoor grills. After surviving the winter, everyone seemed desperate to absorb every possible moment of summer before the cold inevitably returned. But summer in Yakutsk carried its own brutality. The mosquitoes arrived first. I had heard locals joke about them for months, yet nothing prepared me for the reality. Entire clouds of insects emerged from surrounding wetlands and forests. Near the river, they swarmed so densely that breathing without covering the mouth became difficult. People wore protective nets over their faces while fishing or hiking outside the city. Children learned to ignore bites covering their arms and legs. One evening, I joined Pavel and several friends for a fishing trip outside the urban area. The landscape beyond Yakutsk looked endless. Vast forests stretched across the horizon beneath enormous skies glowing with late-night sunlight. The beauty was overwhelming, but the mosquitoes attacked constantly. We covered exposed skin with sprays and smoke from small fires, yet the insects still found every opening. Pavel laughed at my frustration while calmly preparing fishing equipment beside the riverbank. According to him, mosquitoes were simply another tax paid for living in Siberia. During the trip, I finally understood how isolated Yakutia truly was. Hours passed without seeing another vehicle or settlement. Nature dominated everything. Forests, rivers, marshes, and endless land untouched by modern development surrounded the city in every direction. Pavel spoke about winter journeys between remote villages and summer expeditions searching for mammoth bones exposed by melting permafrost. The region held enormous natural wealth beneath the frozen ground. Gold, diamonds, gas, and ancient fossils existed everywhere across Yakutia. Yet extracting those resources required surviving one of the harshest climates on Earth. Around the campfire that night, the conversation turned more serious. One man described how climate change had begun damaging traditional ways of life for indigenous communities across the region. Permafrost thawed unpredictably. Hunting routes changed. Rivers behaved differently. Ancient burial grounds and animal remains surfaced unexpectedly from melting earth. Yakutsk itself faced growing risks because buildings and roads depended completely on stable frozen ground beneath them. Some apartment blocks already showed cracks caused by shifting foundations. Listening to them, I realized the city balanced on fragile conditions that might not last forever. Later, unable to sleep beneath the bright midnight sky, I walked alone toward the river. The air remained surprisingly warm even after midnight. Nearby apartments glowed with light because many residents simply stayed awake longer during summer months. Children still played outside while elderly neighbors sat talking on benches beneath trees. Winter had forced everyone indoors for survival. Summer reversed everything completely. People tried living as intensely as possible before darkness returned. I sat near the water watching boats move slowly across the Lena River beneath pale golden light. The scene felt peaceful, yet something about it carried sadness too. Perhaps it was the knowledge that this warmth existed only briefly. In Yakutsk, every season felt temporary and fragile. Winter always waited somewhere beyond the horizon. A few weeks later, the city celebrated Yakyik, the traditional summer festival of the Yakut people. Thousands gathered in open fields outside the city wearing traditional clothing decorated with silver and fur. There were dances, horse races, music performances, and rituals welcoming the season of warmth and renewal. Large wooden cups filled with kumis, fermented mare's milk, passed between groups of families and friends. Fires burned through the evening while singers performed ancient songs beneath endless daylight. I attended with Lena and her family. Watching the celebration, I understood something important about Yakut culture. People there did not merely survive nature. They built spiritual meaning around its extremes. Winter taught endurance. Summer taught gratitude. Both seasons shaped identity equally. Near dawn, though the sky never became fully dark, Lena asked whether I still planned to leave Yakutsk at the end of the year as I originally intended. I looked across the crowded festival grounds where children danced beside fires while old men sang songs older than the city itself. Then I looked toward the distant forests glowing beneath the pale northern sky. Months earlier, I would have answered immediately. Now I remained silent for several seconds before speaking. Somewhere along the long winter, the frozen roads, the endless nights, and the brutal cold had stopped feeling like obstacles. Instead, they had become part of a life I was no longer certain I wanted to abandon. By August, summer in Yakutsk had reached its peak. The days remained long and strangely dreamlike, but subtle changes already warned people that warmth would not last much longer. Nights became slightly darker. Morning air carried traces of cold hidden beneath the humidity. Leaves along certain roadsides had already started turning pale yellow. Locals noticed these details immediately. After surviving countless winters, they learned to read seasonal changes with almost animal instinct. Nobody wasted summer there. Repairs, construction projects, hunting trips, fishing expeditions, and family gatherings all happened with urgency because everyone understood time was limited. The city itself seemed caught in constant preparation for the return of cold. Construction crews worked day and night repairing roads damaged by melting permafrost. Apartment buildings received insulation upgrades. Heating systems underwent inspections across entire districts. Fuel deliveries increased steadily. Yakutsk treated winter not as a season but as an approaching enemy requiring months of preparation. One afternoon, Pavel invited me to visit an industrial site outside the city where workers maintained underground heating pipelines. We drove across rough muddy roads surrounded by endless stretches of forest and low wetlands buzzing with insects. Along the way, he explained how much hidden infrastructure existed beneath Yakutsk simply to keep the city alive. Massive heating networks transported hot water continuously beneath neighborhoods because failure during winter could become catastrophic within hours. The system never truly rested. Even during summer, workers repaired, replaced, and reinforced damaged sections. At the maintenance site, enormous pipes emerged from the ground like giant rusted arteries crossing the landscape. Steam escaped from valves into warm air while mechanics welded metal under protective masks. The smell of oil, wet soil, and smoke filled everything. Pavel introduced me to several workers who joked constantly despite the exhausting conditions. One older technician named Anton explained that most outsiders imagined Yakutsk as a city defeated by cold. According to him, the opposite was true. The city existed because generations of people refused to surrender to impossible conditions. Every heated apartment, every functioning hospital, every school and market represented years of labor against nature itself. Later that week, smoke appeared across the horizon beyond the city. Forest fires had erupted in remote regions surrounding Yakutia, something that had become increasingly common during recent summers. Ash drifted through parts of the city while the sky turned hazy orange during sunset. The contrast felt disturbing. Only months earlier, people feared freezing to death. Now massive fires consumed forests across one of the coldest regions on Earth. Lena explained that many residents worried deeply about environmental changes. Summers were becoming hotter and drier. Permafrost thawed earlier each year. Ancient frozen ground sometimes collapsed unexpectedly, swallowing roads and damaging villages. Yakutsk depended entirely on stability beneath the surface. If the permafrost changed too quickly, the future of the city itself could become uncertain. One evening, while walking home through smoky air, I noticed workers replacing damaged pavement beside my apartment building. Beneath the broken road lay exposed frozen earth mixed with mud and water. Steam rose from underground pipes into cool evening air. The sight stayed in my mind because it perfectly represented Yakutsk. Heat and ice existed together everywhere. Fire beneath frozen ground. Warm apartment standing above ancient permafrost. Human life balanced constantly between survival and collapse. Around that time, I began helping Lena teach conversational English classes twice a week at a local community center. Most students were teenagers preparing for university or hoping to travel abroad someday. They asked endless questions about other countries, warmer climates, and life beyond Siberia. Yet many also spoke proudly about Yakutia. One boy described winter horse races across frozen valleys. A girl explained how northern lights looked from her grandmother's village far from city lights. Another student said people from warmer places often seemed weak because they complained about ordinary discomforts. Listening to them, I realized younger generations still carried strong attachment to the region despite its hardships. Yakutsk was not merely where they lived. It shaped how they understood endurance, community, and identity. After one class, Lena and I walked slowly beside the river while smoke from distant fires dimmed the evening sunlight. She admitted she once dreamed of leaving Yakutsk permanently when she was younger. She studied in Moscow for several years and enjoyed the opportunities there, but eventually returned because she felt strangely disconnected away from the north. According to her, people who grow up in extreme places often struggle elsewhere because ordinary life begins feeling emotionally flat. The intensity of Yakutia changed people permanently. I understood what she meant. Months earlier, the cold terrified me daily. Now, even the harshness of the environment carried emotional weight I could not easily explain. That night, I stood outside my apartment building long after midnight watching smoke drift beneath northern stars. Somewhere beyond the forests, enormous fires burned across land that remained frozen deep underground for thousands of years. Yet the city continued glowing with life beneath the dark sky. Cars moved through illuminated streets. Children laughed from open windows. Heating pipes hummed softly beneath the earth. Yakutsk survived through contradiction. It was a city built on ice, sustained by fire, and defended by people stubborn enough to remain where nature constantly tested the limits of human endurance. September arrived quietly in Yakutsk, but everyone felt the shift immediately. Summer colors faded almost overnight. Trees that had glowed green and gold during August began dropping leaves across wet streets. The air sharpened each morning with unmistakable warning. People moved faster again. Hardware stores filled with customers buying insulation, tools, heaters, and winter clothing. Mechanics worked non-stop preparing vehicles for freezing temperatures. Markets sold thick fur hats and heavy boots beside the last fresh berries of the season. The city had entered preparation mode once more. Winter was returning. One morning, I woke to frost covering the corners of my apartment window for the first time in months. The sight produced a strange emotion inside me. Fear still existed, but alongside it came familiarity. The approaching cold no longer felt like an enemy from another world. Instead, it felt like the return of something powerful and inevitable that governed life there. I understood now why locals respected winter almost like a living force. You could not defeat it. You could only prepare yourself properly and endure it together. At the community center, attendance in English classes slowly decreased because students became busy helping families prepare for colder months. Several told me they spent weekends gathering firewood at villages outside the city or repairing roofs before snow arrived. Even modern apartment residents carried habits shaped by generations of surviving severe winters. Nothing was left until the last moment because mistakes during Siberian winters could become fatal. One evening after class, Lena invited me to dinner with several friends at a small restaurant overlooking the river. Outside, cold rain mixed occasionally with tiny flakes of snow that melted immediately upon touching the ground. Inside, the restaurant glowed with warm yellow light while people removed heavy coats and ordered hot soups and strong drinks. The atmosphere felt intimate, almost protective against the growing darkness outside. During dinner, the conversation turned toward memory and isolation. One man described spending part of his childhood in a remote mining settlement hundreds of kilometers north of Yakutsk where winter temperatures dropped below -60 regularly. Another woman spoke about relatives living in villages accessible only by riverboats during summer and ice roads during winter. Listening to them, I realized how enormous and empty Yakutia truly was. The city itself, despite feeling isolated to outsiders, functioned as a major center of civilization within an immense wilderness stretching farther than most people could imagine. After dinner, Lena and I walked beside the river beneath cold wind carrying the smell of wet earth and smoke. The water looked darker now beneath earlier sunsets. She asked whether I had noticed how people changed during autumn in Yakutsk. Summer made everyone emotional and energetic because warmth felt temporary. Autumn, however, created seriousness. People became quieter, more focused, almost disciplined. The city prepared mentally as much as physically for survival. A few weeks later, the first lasting snow arrived during the night. I woke before sunrise and looked outside to see streets transformed completely. Cars, rooftops, trees, and sidewalks disappeared beneath fresh white snow glowing beneath streetlights. Workers already cleared roads while children walked carefully toward school wearing thick winter clothing again. The cycle had restarted. Yet this time, the sight no longer shocked me. Instead, it felt strangely beautiful. Later that day, I visited the market alone. Vendors sold frozen fish once again outdoors. Steam rose from food stalls into cold air. People moved through the snow with practiced efficiency. Watching them, I suddenly realized how deeply the city had changed me over the past year. Before arriving, I measured comfort through convenience and ease. In Yakutsk, comfort meant functioning heating, reliable friends, warm food, and knowing someone would help if disaster struck. Hardship stripped life down to essentials. Perhaps that was why relationships there felt more genuine. People depended on each other in ways rarely necessary elsewhere. Near the end of October, temperatures dropped below -40 again for the first time that season. Darkness returned rapidly. The sun appeared briefly before disappearing beneath the horizon by late afternoon. One evening, while walking home through heavy snowfall, I passed a group of workers repairing a stalled bus beside the road. Their faces were already covered with white frost while tools clanged against frozen metal beneath yellow streetlights. Nearby passengers waited patiently inside another vehicle sent to collect them. Nobody shouted or complained. Everyone simply accepted the situation and adapted. That scene stayed with me because it captured the spirit of Yakutsk perfectly. Survival there depended less on strength than on endurance and cooperation. As winter tightened its grip around the city once more, I began thinking seriously about whether I would leave as originally planned. My contract at the community center would end soon. Flights south remained available before the cold deepened further. Months earlier, departure had seemed obvious. Now the decision felt unexpectedly painful. Somewhere between the frozen rivers, endless nights, summer fires, and northern lights, Yakutsk had stopped feeling temporary. The city had entered my mind slowly through suffering, beauty, and routine until it became impossible to imagine forgetting it completely. November returned with full force to Yakutsk. Snowstorms swallowed entire streets overnight. Temperatures fell so quickly that exposed skin burned within seconds again. The Lena River slowly hardened beneath thickening layers of ice while the city prepared for another endless winter. Engines growled outside apartment buildings through every hour of darkness. Smoke rose constantly into black skies lit by pale stars and northern lights. It was the same world that had terrified me when I first arrived, yet now I walked through it differently. My body moved automatically through winter routines. Layers of clothing. Extra gloves in my bag. Phone batteries kept warm inside inner pockets. Slow, careful breathing through scarves. The cold still demanded respect, but it no longer felt foreign. One evening, while drinking tea at the cafe where I had first met Pavel months earlier, he finally asked the question everyone seemed to avoid directly. He asked whether I was leaving before the worst part of winter arrived again. The room around us glowed with orange light reflected against frosted windows. Workers sat nearby eating soup while snow covered parked cars outside almost completely. For several seconds, I could not answer. Not because I lacked a decision, but because I realized the answer frightened me slightly. I told him I had decided to stay another year. Pavel smiled quietly as if he had expected it long before I understood it myself. News of my decision spread surprisingly quickly among the people I had met throughout the year. Lena hugged me so hard that snow fell from her coat onto the apartment floor. Sergei laughed loudly and immediately began warning me that surviving one winter in Yakutsk meant nothing compared to surviving several consecutively. Even students at the community center seemed genuinely pleased. Their reactions made me understand something important. In harsh places, people form stronger attachments because survival creates emotional closeness naturally. Shared hardship removes distance between individuals faster than comfort ever could. As winter deepened further, daily life resumed its familiar rhythm. Darkness returned almost completely. Some mornings never seemed to become fully bright at all. Yet now I noticed beauty hidden inside routines that once felt unbearable. The sound of snow crunching sharply beneath boots during -50-degree mornings. Steam rising from street food stalls beneath glowing lamps. Frost patterns spreading across bus windows like delicate white forests. Families laughing together inside overheated apartments while blizzards screamed outside. Yakutsk taught people to value warmth differently because cold surrounded everything constantly. Warmth became more than temperature. It meant trust, friendship, memory, and human presence. During December, Lena invited me to celebrate New Year with her family. In Yakutia, the holiday carried enormous emotional importance because it arrived during the darkest period of winter. People decorated apartments brightly with lights and ornaments to resist the endless night outside. Children waited excitedly for gifts while adults prepared massive amounts of food despite shortages and difficult conditions. That evening, Snow fell heavily across the city while fireworks exploded above frozen streets. Inside the apartment, several generations gathered around crowded tables covered with salads, meat dishes, bread, fish, tea, vodka, and desserts. Old Soviet songs played from television broadcasts while relatives argued, laughed, and told stories late into the night. At midnight, everyone stepped briefly onto the balcony despite the freezing cold to watch fireworks erupt across Yakutsk. The entire city glowed beneath falling snow. Smoke drifted upward through colorful explosions while distant cheers echoed between apartment blocks. Standing there beside Lena and her family, wrapped in layers of winter clothing beneath northern darkness, I realized I no longer felt like an outsider observing life in the coldest city on earth. Somehow, slowly and almost invisibly, the city had accepted me. Weeks later, during one of the coldest nights of the year, I walked alone toward the frozen Lena River again. The temperature had fallen below -50. My eyelashes froze immediately while every breath formed thick white clouds around my face. Yet the fear I once carried was gone. Above the river, northern lights moved silently across the sky in waves of green and blue light brighter than I had ever seen before. The city behind me hummed softly with engines, heating systems, and human life fighting against impossible cold. I stood there for a long time listening to the frozen silence surrounding everything. When I first arrived in Yakutsk, I believed survival there depended only on physical endurance. But after a year in the city, I understood the deeper truth. People remained not because they enjoyed suffering or ignored hardship. They stayed because extreme places reveal what truly matters. In climates where nature can kill carelessness instantly, human kindness becomes essential. Warm rooms become sacred. Shared meals become celebrations. Friendship becomes survival itself. The cold strips life down to its most honest form. As I finally turned back toward the glowing city lights, snow falling softly beneath the northern sky, I realized something that would have seemed impossible a year earlier. In the coldest city in the world, I had found the warmest place I had ever known.